Namaste. In this series of talks on Sri Aurobindo, Eternity's Delegate, today I will be focusing on the topic Sri Aurobindo, the Revolutionary Nationalist. Sri Aurobindo once said that first and foremost he was a poet and a revolutionary. I choose to take the word poet here in its deeper Indian sense, that of a kavi, a seer, a rishi. This rishi poet is also a revolutionary because he who brought down the new supramental consciousness on earth started a revolution of an entirely new kind. But Sri Aurobindo, as we know, was a revolutionary in another sense of the term as well. One whom Chittaranjan Das in a British courtroom had spoken of as the poet of patriotism. It is not easy to shed light on any one particular facet of Sri Aurobindo, given the integral personality that he was and is. But with all humility and relying mostly on his own account of this aspect of his life, I'm going to try my best to highlight a few salient points of his revolutionary nationalist aspect, with this caveat that what I share here today is still a highly incomplete picture. I will also try to situate his revolutionary work in the context of his deeper spiritual vision of nation, nationalism, and India's true role in the future destiny of humanity. In his August 15, 1947 message, Sri Aurobindo had said, "I have always held and said that India was arising, not to serve her own material interests only, to achieve expansion, greatness, power, and prosperity, though these too she must not neglect, and certainly not like others to acquire domination of other peoples, but to live also for God and the world as a helper and leader of the whole human race." This is how Sri Aurobindo looked at the role and mission of India. And it is in this light of this mission of India that we must understand Sri Aurobindo's revolutionary work. He saw India as having the potential to fulfill the role of being a spiritual leader of the world. But first, India had to be free, politically independent, to shape her own future. Now, when we think of Sri Aurobindo, the revolutionary aspect, we think of one whom the British Empire for decades considered as the most dangerous man. This was the term used by Lord Minto, the Viceroy of India. Similar ideas were expressed by several other British officials in 1900s. The Lieutenant Governor of Bengal, for example, in 1908, spoke of Sri Aurobindo as the undisputed leader of Bengal revolutionaries. But why was he considered the most dangerous man? Maybe because he was able to inspire so many young Indians to give all for the fight of India's freedom. Maybe because his pen, which was his chief weapon, was able to ignite the fire of freedom in so many young hearts. Maybe because he also worked behind the scenes to bring together different revolutionaries in various parts of the country. All perfectly valid reasons. But there was something more, something deeper. When people saw Sri Aurobindo, they saw a somewhat quiet young Bengali man of gentle disposition with deep-set eyes which seemed to be gazing beyond the horizon, and having a soft voice, dressed in simple clothes, with no airs or pretense of any sort of being this extraordinary intellectual giant, England educated with great honors and accomplishments. But expressed through this outer quiet self was the soul of a yogi, a heart and mind of a yogi. It was the yogi in Sri Aurobindo which made his revolutionary work distinctly visionary and futuristic. It was his yogic strength, the absolute purity and sincerity of his intention and of his work, the deepest truth of his vision, which saw India as a mother, a Shakti, a power, a godhead, that made him the most dangerous man for British to ever contend with. Because deep down, perhaps even the British knew that the soul of India exists in her spirituality, in her yoga. And throughout the long march of history, whenever India needed to be woken up from her slumber, it was her yogis, her rishis, who showed the path that was right, the good, the path of the truth. Sri Aurobindo, the yogi-revolutionary, was a danger for the British because he had the potential to wake up a sleeping India. And Sri Aurobindo did awaken the soul of India when he infused a spiritual truth, a spiritual power in this mantra of Bande Mataram, an invocation to Mother India that was given by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee in Anand Mat. But this Bande Mataram, this phrase was as if lying dormant in some idea field, idea plane of the nation's psyche, waiting for Sri Aurobindo to charge it, to infuse it with the spiritual force behind it. Having done that, the whole country as if woke up in response. The Shakti, the force had been awakened, taking the form of an aspiration for freedom. As we know, later on, the most significant way in which the Divine Mother, the Divine Shakti, was invoked most powerfully by Sri Aurobindo was when he would embody the consciousness of the Mother in Savitri. But before Savitri came Bhavani Bharati, his only poem in Sanskrit, written somewhere in between 1904 and 1908, which presents the picture of an awakening of the heart and mind of a nation to the call and cry of the Mother India, Bhavani Bharati. This poem, incidentally, was confiscated by Calcutta police and rediscovered only in 1985. As we read the poem, it inspires one to fight for one's motherland, to bring back her full glory, to sacrifice all in order to bring about the victory of truth over falsehood. The Mother of Nation asks for tremendous sacrifice. It is not a call for the faint-hearted. She needs warriors to defend her honor, to seat her on her golden throne. Reading the poem gives us a glimpse of the heart of Sri Aurobindo, the revolutionary Bhakta of Ma Bharati, who sang of the sacrifice that the mother demands of her children, and who heard the cry of his mother and plunged deep into the fight for her freedom, sometimes working from behind the scenes and sometimes in front. And we hear the early whisperings of this work, this yearning, this aspiration to work for his motherland, when we read his famous letter to his wife Mrinalini Devi. But I'm jumping a little ahead of the story. So let me begin with February 6, 1893, the day Sri Aurobindo stepped on the Indian shore at Apollo Bandar, Bombay. A very special moment indeed for India, for the world, for the humanity, and for Sri Aurobindo himself. He would later describe this moment as a moment when a vast calm descended upon him. Within the first 6 months of his joining Baroda service, Sri Aurobindo had already started publicly expressing his political views. He wrote a 9-part series titled New Lamps for the Old in a journal called Indu Prakash. His target in this article was not so much as the British government, but rather the methods of petitioning, appealing, bargaining that were used by the leaders of the leaders of Congress at that time. Sri Aurobindo had this rare insight with which he could see the inherent defects of these methods, which he called as sort of like practicing a mendicant politics of begging, of appealing, what he said as politics of small administrative reforms, passing pious resolutions as appeals to foreign rulers instead of asking or working for the fundamental need that the country had, which was to gain total freedom from foreign rule itself. He was still in his early 20s, and already Sri Aurobindo was stirring up the dormant fire with his idealism, asking his fellow countrymen to choose instead the path of boldness, the path of courage. As one of his first behind-the-scene political moves in Baroda, Sri Aurobindo sent Jatin Banerjee to Bengal to start up revolutionary work. Later, he asked his brother, Barendra Ghosh, to also join Jatin and take up the revolutionary work. He himself would soon become associated with a number of secret societies, number of secret revolutionary societies in both the eastern and western parts of the country, working as a secret link between them. He applied for a month's leave in April 1902 and spent all the time working in these revolutionary societies. Members in these working societies were taking oath to fight for India's freedom, to secure India's freedom at any cost, and to not reveal the secret of the society to anyone. Sri Aurobindo himself administered the oath to several revolutionaries. During this time, he also met Sister Nivedita, and this was in Baroda again in 1902. And in the same year, little later, he met Lokmanya Tilak as well, for someone whom he referred to as a man of indomitable will and unwavering devotion. During a trip to Bengal in 1903, Sri Aurobindo also met Jatindranath Mukherjee, popularly known as Baga Jatin, who was described as one of the great daredevil revolutionaries of the time. Baga Jatin agreed to collaborate with Sri Aurobindo, particularly on this one idea of recruiting Indian soldiers from the British regiments for the work of revolution. One of the biggest impacts, all this organizing work that Sri Aurobindo was doing at that time, was that it led to a widespread diffusion of the idea of revolution in the country's mindset. And this, Sri Aurobindo said later on, that was one of the primary goals of his political action. In his words, to get into the mind of the people a settled will for freedom and the necessity of a struggle to achieve it. In 1905, Sri Aurobindo wrote his famous pamphlet Bhavani Mandir. This was again inspired by Sri Bankim Chandra's Anand Mat. A copy of this pamphlet was actually used as evidence later on in the Alipore bomb trial. This Bhavani Mandir is interesting as a classical piece in India's political literature because it was a very early diagnosis of the fundamental problem which was ailing India at the time, and also the correct remedy to work around that problem. What Sri Aurobindo said was that all things in India fail for the want of Shakti, courage. Even our bhakti, even our jnana would mean nothing if we do not have the power, the courage, the force, the Shakti to execute it. And the remedy? To draw strength. Where would we draw the strength? from that inexhaustible perennial source of strength, the Adi Shakti of the Eternal Himself, from which flows all existence, all creation. This demands an intense adoration, worship, tapasya, sadhana of the Divine Mother. One of Sri Aurobindo's biographers called Bhavani Mandir as a tiny packet of political and spiritual dynamite, which gave endless nightmares to British officials. But for the revolutionaries, it acted as a mighty inspiration and supreme driving force. Time now to recall that specific letter of Sri Aurobindo, dated August 30th, 1905. A letter he wrote to his wife Mrinalini Devi. This was the first time he spoke of his deep aspiration, his inner quest to realize the divinity within, his intense yearning to see his motherland free and strong, and his profound passion to offer all that he has and all that he is at the service of the divine. He called these as his three madnesses. We may see them as the true markings of the yogi-revolutionary that Sri Aurobindo was. Let me read few passages, few extracts from the letter. He began, "Dear Mrinalini, I think you have understood by now that the man with whose fate yours has been linked is a man of a very unusual character. I have three madnesses. The first one is this. I firmly believe that the accomplishments, genius, higher education and learning and wealth that God has given me are His. I have a right to spend for my own purposes only what is needed for the maintenance of the family and is otherwise absolutely essential. The rest must be returned to God. My second madness has only recently seized me. It is this: by whatever means, I must have the direct vision of God. If God exists, there must be some way to experience His existence, to meet Him face to face. However arduous this path is, I have made up my mind to follow it." And then he continues with his third madness. "My third madness is that while others look upon their country as an inert piece of matter, a few meadows and fields, forests and hills and rivers, I look upon my country as my mother. I adore her. I worship her as the mother. What would a son do if a demon sat on his mother's breast and started sucking her blood? I know I have the strength to deliver this fallen race. It is not physical strength. It is the strength of knowledge. This feeling is not new in me. I was born with it. It is in my very marrow. God sent me to earth to accomplish this great mission. The seed began to sprout when I was 14. By the time I was 18, the roots of the resolution had grown firm and unshakable. This unshakable patriotism which fired his being since his boyhood was not a mere love for the country of his birth, or even a yearning for its freedom and greatness. It was truly a worship of India. Another momentous event from 1905 that had to do with Lord Curzon's decision to partition Bengal. And with that was reached that threshold which would make Sri Aurobindo decide to come to the front of the action. Openly joining the nationalist movement, he made his first public appearance at a Swadeshi meeting in Baroda on 24th September 1905. he could clearly see that the partition was part and parcel of this sinister policy to enfeeble the growing patriotic spirit at that time. There was also another sinister motive of dividing the Bengali people by driving a wedge between Hindus and Muslims. He reminded the people to stay united, saying that this measure was a blow straight at the heart of the nation. The Bengal partition, however, came into effect in October 1905 amidst numerous protests. During the Benares Congress that was held in December 1905, Sri Aurobindo pushed for the adoption of a fourfold program of boycott. He returned to Baroda, but a month later, in February 1906, he took another leave for 2 months and added his summer vacation, giving him entire several months that he spent in Bengal for the nationalist cause. In April 1906, at Barisal Conference, he and Bipin Chandra Pal led a protest march despite the ban that was imposed by the government to protest against the partition, in which many people were injured by the police lathi charge. Sri Aurobindo returned to Baroda in June 1906, but again immediately took a year's leave without pay and returned back to Calcutta in July. For all practical purposes, he was leaving Baroda's service for good. Soon after that, he joined as the principal of newly founded Bengal National College. These years from 1906 to 1910 marked the years of his intense political activity, which included speaking at several rallies and events. Another monumental thing that he did during this time was starting of the 2 journals. At the suggestion of his brother, he started a journal in Bengali, Yugantar, which was to preach open revolt and absolute denial of the foreign rule, and also incorporated such items as series of articles containing instructions for guerrilla warfare. Sri Aurobindo himself wrote some of the articles in some of the early issues. However, he exercised a tone of general control in his tone. The Yugantar had specific orders from Sri Aurobindo that it would refuse to defend itself in any British court on the ground that it simply did not accept the existence of British government of the time. This, as a result, immensely increased the prestige, popularity and influence of Yugantar. Later, in August 1906, Bipin Chandra Pal decided to start an English language paper for the nationalists to champion the cause of nationalists, and Sri Aurobindo became the editor of this paper, Bande Mataram. And not only editing the paper, Sri Aurobindo directed the entire policy of this paper. And soon, immediately, the paper became hugely popular and circulated throughout the length and breadth of the country, deeply shaping the political consciousness, political thought of the country at the time. Its huge popularity was also there because of another reason, the penmanship of Sri Aurobindo, which incorporated bold attitude, vigorous ideas, clear thinking, refined witticism and scorching sarcasm all at the same time. Even the British press was forced to take notice of this, and many reputed British papers started reproducing long extracts from Bande Mataram for their readers back in England. Sri Aurobindo was the first political revolutionary to openly put forward the idea of Purn Swaraj, complete and absolute independence for India. He was also the first to advocate an economic, judicial, administrative educational and national boycott as a tactic to fight the imperialists. In Bande Mataram pages, he laid down clear and specific guidelines for setting up Swadeshi, which would include a national education system, a system of national arbitration courts, and a national organization for self-government. This work showed his unique, visionary, rare combination of remarkable idealism and practical program of action. These proposals and actions soon began to shift the political consciousness in the country. Most of these ideas were later followed through either in part or in different forms by political leaders who came afterwards, including Gandhiji. In 1907, both Yugantar and Bande Mataram received warning from the police that strict action would be taken against them if they continued to publish what the government considered inflammatory and seditious articles. Their offices were searched. On 16th August 1907, a warrant was also issued against Sri Aurobindo, charging him with sedition. When the warrant was received by him, Sri Aurobindo went to the police court himself and offered himself for arrest. But as there was no proof of his being the editor of Bande Mataram, he was soon acquitted. But as a result, he came in this full blaze of publicity, something that he had been studiously avoiding till then. And he had now become the undisputed leader of Indian nationalists. It was during this sedition trial that Rabindranath Tagore wrote his famous poem in Bengali titled Namaskar, in which he described Sri Aurobindo as the voice incarnate of India's soul and country's friend. In the month of December 1907, Sri Aurobindo gave several public speeches championing the cause of Indian nationalists. These were done in Midnapur, Calcutta, and several other places. He explained the nationalists' positions, his program of boycott, as well as the cause of Swadeshi. Another event that happened in 1907, just a little later, was the split between the nationalists and moderates at the Surat National Congress. Sri Aurobindo actually played a monumental role in this historic event, and he would recount that later in a letter in 1936 when he wrote, "History very seldom records the things that were decisive but took place behind the veil. It records the show in front of the curtain. Very few people know that it was I, without consulting Tilak, who gave the order that led to the breaking of the Congress and was responsible for the refusal to join the newfangled moderate convention, which were the two decisive happenings at Surat." Sri Aurobindo had started his yoga in Baroda in 1904 after taking some advice on pranayam from a friend. He said he was doing this yoga for his nation, for drawing spiritual force and spiritual strength for the work for his motherland. A few years later, in January 1908, Sri Aurobindo met Vishnu Bhaskar Lele, a Maharashtrian yogi, who instructed him on how to reach complete silence of the mind and a full immobility of the whole consciousness. Sri Aurobindo was able to attain this in just 3 days, and he later said that this silence never left him since then. All his political work, political writing, and other activity happened with the silent mind after that realization. Once, when he was asked to give a speech at a rally, Sri Aurobindo felt that he had nothing to say. On Lele's advice, he simply went to the dais, did a namaskar to the audience, and he felt the whole speech coming to him from a source other than his mind, other than his intelligence. Sri Aurobindo was keenly aware that something was brewing up in the atmosphere at that time. He could sense the approaching storm, if you will, because the British government was continuing with its repressive policies against freedom workers. And the storm did come on April 30th, 1908, when Prafulla Chaki and Khudiram Bose threw a bomb at a closed carriage which was supposed to be carrying District Magistrate Kingsford. But unfortunately, the bomb killed two innocent ladies who were there in the carriage. Several revolutionaries were arrested. On May 5th, 1908, Sri Aurobindo was also arrested and sent to prison. Being in prison, something that would be the most horrific experience for an ordinary person, became a spiritual retreat for Sri Aurobindo. As he wrote in Kara Kahini, Tales of the Prison Life, and I quote, "I have spoken of a year's imprisonment. It would have been more appropriate to speak of a year's living in a forest, in an ashram, hermitage. For long I had made great efforts for a direct vision, Sakshat Darshan of the Lord of my heart, had entertained the immense hope of knowing the preserver of the world, the Supreme Person, Purushottama, as friend and master. But due to the pull of 1,000 worldly desires, attachment towards numerous activities, the deep darkness of ignorance, I did not succeed in that effort. At long last, the most merciful, all-good Lord Shiv Hari destroyed all these enemies at one stroke and helped me in my path, pointed to the yoga ashram, himself staying as guru and companion in my little abode of retirement." And then he continued, "The only result of the wrath of the British government was that I found God." Another extremely endearing side of Sri Aurobindo comes to the surface when we read Tales of Prison Life and read his descriptions of various experiences and observations he had at the prison. These are humorous and witty descriptions, of course. The hearing of this historic Alipore bomb trial began in October 1908 in the court of Mr. Beechcroft, who was actually a fellow scholar of Sri Aurobindo from the Cambridge days. This was the first state trial of its magnitude in India at the time. The revolutionaries were charged with conspiracy of waging war against the king, punishable by death by hanging. The case dragged on in the preliminary hearings in the magistrate court, involving 1,000 artifacts as evidences and 222 witnesses, which was followed by another trial in the Sessions Court, which involved even more, 1,438 exhibits and 206 witnesses. And during this period, the under trial prisoners were kept illegally in Presidency jail under tortuous conditions. While all this was going on, Sri Aurobindo was pursuing the yoga of Bhagavad Gita and meditating on the truths of Upanishads. We must make a mention of the historic defense appeal made by Sri Aurobindo's defense counsel Chittaranjan Das in his closing statement when he said, Long after this controversy is hushed in silence, long after this turmoil, this agitation ceases, long after he is dead and gone, he will be looked upon as the poet of patriotism, as the prophet of nationalism, and the lover of humanity. Long after he is dead and gone, his words will be echoed and re-echoed, not only in India, but across distant seas and lands. On May 6, 1909, exactly a year after his arrest, Sri Aurobindo was acquitted of all the charges, with the judge condemning the flimsy nature of the evidence against him. All those 1,000 evidences and 1,438 exhibits, he called them as flimsy evidence against Sri Aurobindo. Now, Sri Aurobindo would later write about his acquittal. I attribute my escape to no human agency, but first of all to the protection of the mother of us all, who has never been absent from me, but always held me in her arms and shielded me from grief and disaster. And secondarily, to the prayers of thousands which have been going up to her on my behalf ever since I was arrested. If it is the love of my country which led me into danger, it is also the love of my countrymen which has brought me safe through it. Sri Aurobindo recounted some of his spiritual experiences that he had in the prison in this famous Uttarpara speech delivered on May 30th, 1909. He spoke of how it was Sri Krishna who was guiding his yoga in the prison and showing him the work that he must do after coming out of the prison, the work for a true spiritual liberation and upliftment of the people of India, the people of the world. He also spoke about this realization of Vasudeva Sarvamiti. And let's read what Sri Aurobindo said in that speech about this particular realization. I looked at the jail, he said, that secluded me from men, and it was no longer its high walls that I was imprisoned. It was Vasudeva who surrounded me. I walked under the branches of the tree in front of my cell, but it was not the tree. I knew it was Vasudeva. It was Sri Krishna whom I saw standing there and holding over me his shade. I looked at the bars of my cell, the very grating that did duty for a door, and again I saw Vasudeva. It was Narayana who was guarding and standing sentry over me. Or I lay on the coarse blankets that were given me for a couch and felt the arms of Sri Krishna around me, the arms of my lover and friend. I looked at the prisoners in the jail, the thieves, the murderers, the swindlers, and as I looked at them, I saw Vasudeva. It was Narayana whom I found in these darkened souls and misused bodies. He went on to add how he saw Sri Krishna in the prosecutor, in the judge, in every person present in the courtroom. During this 1 year of Sri Aurobindo's imprisonment, much had changed in the political landscape of the country. Condition had gotten even worse as the government was continuing with its strongly repressive policies against nationalists. Both Yugantar and Bande Mataram had been closed down. Many of the nationalist leaders were also sent to jail. And sensing this change in the political landscape, Sri Aurobindo decided to start a new paper, Karmayogin, which he added almost single-handedly from June 1909 to February 1910. The purpose of this paper, he said, was to rightly place political work in the context of this rediscovery of eternal truths that form the very basis, the foundation of the mighty spiritual culture and civilization of India. He described in an eloquent passage this ideal of Karmayogin, and I would like to share a big extract from that because this is hugely relevant for the times we are in today. He wrote, "We aim not at the alteration of a form of government, but at the building up of a nation. Of that task, politics is a part, but only a part. We shall devote ourselves not to politics alone, nor to social questions alone, nor to theology or philosophy or literature or science by themselves, but we include all these in one entity, which we believe to be all important, the Dharma, the national religion, which we also believe to be universal." He continued, "We must know our past and recover it for the purposes of our future. Our business is to realize ourselves first and to mold everything to the law of India's eternal life and nature. It will therefore be the object of the Karmayogin to read the heart of our religion, our society, our philosophy, politics, literature, art, jurisprudence, science, thought, everything that was and is ours, so that we may be able to say to ourselves and to our nation, 'This is our Dharma.' We shall review European civilization entirely from the standpoint of Indian thought and knowledge, and seek to throw off from us the dominating stamp of the Occident. What we have to take from the West, we shall take as Indians, and the Dharma once discovered, we shall strive our utmost not only to profess, but to live in our individual actions, in our social life, in our political endeavors." I read out this long passage because it beautifully and powerfully highlights the most important work that still remains to be done by India and by Indians today. The yogic and spiritual basis of his political work was now coming center stage. Similar themes we notice in several of his speeches given during that time. But the growing popularity of Karmayogin was also becoming a concern for the British officials, and they started working on plans to deport Sri Aurobindo. When Sri Aurobindo when he became aware of that, he wrote an open letter in Karmayogin, making the public aware of the government plans. And as if in response, he also started a Bengali paper titled Dharma. Even in this short political stint after acquittal from Alipore, Sri Aurobindo made many valuable contributions to the cause of Swaraj. His actions exhibited a remarkable and a rare combination of what's often are seen as contradictory traits in a politician, that of steadfastness and statesmanship. During this period, Sri Aurobindo also delved deep into the problem of Indian education, an area that he believed must be recast in the light of the true Indian spirit and the destiny of humanity toward greater perfectibility. For almost a year, from 1909 to 1910, May 1909, after his acquittal till 1910, February 1910, Sri Aurobindo worked hard as the sole remaining leader of Indian nationalists to revive the movement. And then came that night at the Karmayogin office, mid-February 1910, which Sri Aurobindo described again in his own words, written in the third person. Sri Aurobindo received information of the government's intention to search the office and arrest him. While considering what should be his attitude, he received a sudden command from above to go to Chandarnagar in French India. He obeyed the command at once, for it was now his rule to move only as he was moved by the divine guidance and never to resist and depart from it. He did not stay to consult with anyone, but in 10 minutes was at the river Ghat and in a boat plying on the Ganges. In a few hours he was at Chandarnagar, where he went into secret residence. He sent a message to Sister Nivedita asking her to take up the editing of Karmayogin in his absence. This was the end of his active connection with his two journals. At Chandarnagar, he plunged entirely into solitary meditation and ceased all other activity. Motilal Roy, who would see Sri Aurobindo regularly at Chandarnagar, had many talks with him about yoga, and later he would describe how Sri Aurobindo appeared to be completely surrendered and moved by some higher source. Sri Aurobindo there had many visions on subtle planes, including the visions of three goddesses, the three Vedic goddesses, Ila, Mahi and Saraswati, whom he later identified in Pondicherry. A little later, he received another divine command and left for Pondicherry. A few young revolutionaries of Uttarpara took him in a boat to Calcutta, from where he boarded the Dupleix and arrived at Pondicherry on April 4th, 1910. Around the same time, the British government had launched another prosecution against him for a signed article in Karmayogin. Apparently, the British still were considering him as the most dangerous man. But in his absence, the charge was pressed against the paper's printer, who was convicted, but this conviction was again quashed in an appeal in Calcutta High Court. This was the third time a prosecution against Sri Aurobindo had failed. It was God who was leading India's fight for freedom, Sri Aurobindo often said. Just as all his political activity was God-directed, so was his decision to leave politics. And as he clarified later in a letter in October 1932, there was not the least bit of despair or a sense of futility behind his withdrawal. He added in that letter, "I may also say that I did not leave politics because I felt I could do nothing more there. Such an idea was very far from me. I came away because I did not want anything to interfere with my yoga, and because I got a very distinct adesh in this matter. For the rest, I have never known any will of mine for any major event in the conduct of the world affairs to fail in the end, though it may take a long time for the world forces to fulfill it." We must also not forget that even from his cave of tapasya in Pondicherry, Sri Aurobindo had a clear view of Indian and world situation and was ready to exert the subtle force that he was in possession of, a higher mental or intuitive power of consciousness. And after 1926, over mental consciousness to guide or shape the events. Sri Aurobindo's political work was guided by his vast yogic vision. Politics, in fact, was never the end goal of his revolutionary work. He saw that India was going through a tapasya of her own, and he could realize that behind the painfully brutal experience of being colonized and oppressed by the British lay a working out of a larger plan of nature, which included India's rebirth for a new age. Writing in Karmayogin, he explained that a civilization which had a distinctly different and stubborn individuality an aggressive focus on commercialism and materialism, the very anti-type, if you will, in temperament and culture from the Indian, became nature's instrument to accelerate the breaking down and destruction of this worn-out, rigid mold in which India's high ideals and spirits had come to be narrowly confined over the long march of her history. India needed a jolt, to put it in simple words. The ruthlessness of the colonial rule was that jolt, that destructive force which would eventually lead India to wake up and rediscover herself again. India had to come to close quarters with that efficient democratic machinery, that efficient organization that the British had mastered. India had to draw that into herself as if to absorb the democratic spirit and methods so that eventually she may rise beyond them. He added, we have to throw away the individualism and materialism and keep the democracy. We have to solve for the human race the problem of harmonizing and spiritualizing its impulses towards liberty, equality, and fraternity. So thus it was that behind the outer events, the Rishi nationalist that Sri Aurobindo was, he could see nature's means to synthesize two distinct streams of humanity's eternal seeking, perfection in the field of matter and in the field of spirit, to coming together of them, synthesizing of them. And this, he said, was also how India must renew herself, making her eternal wisdom once again relevant for her children and for humanity at large. What a remarkable insight Sri Aurobindo gives us. He makes us see how a deeper hidden force guides the destiny of nations, the experiences that nations go through, the yoga that nations must do in their path to rediscover their true dharma for every age. Sri Aurobindo saw India as the spiritual battlefield of the world, where the final victory over the forces of darkness and ignorance would be achieved. It was this inner seeing of India's role in the larger evolutionary march of humanity that was guiding his work for India's political freedom, including the ideals that he put forward for his fellow revolutionaries. He said, our ideal of Swaraj involves no hatred of any other nation, nor of the administration which is now established by law in the country. Our ideal of patriotism proceeds on the basis of love and brotherhood, and it looks beyond the unity of the nation and envisages the ultimate unity of mankind. But it is a unity of brothers, equals and free men that we seek, not the unity of master and serf, of devourer and devoured. But Sri Aurobindo, however, was no moralistic idealist. In a remarkable autobiographical note, again written in the third person, he described the core of his political revolutionary work, the practice, the guiding principle and practice of his work. He wrote, in some quarters there is this idea that Sri Aurobindo's political standpoint was entirely pacifist, that he was opposed in principle and in practice to all violence, and that he denounced terrorism, insurrection, etc. as entirely forbidden by the spirit and letter of Hindu religion. It is even suggested that he was a forerunner of the gospel of ahimsa. This is quite incorrect. Sri Aurobindo is neither an impotent moralist nor a weak pacifist. The rule of confining political action to passive resistance was adopted as the best policy for the national movement at that stage, and not as a part of a gospel of non-violence or pacific idealism. Peace is a part of the highest ideal, but it must be spiritual, or at the very least, psychological in its basis. Without a change in human nature, it cannot come with any finality. If it is attempted on any other basis, moral principle or gospel of ahimsa or any other, it will fail, and even may leave things worse than before. He continued, Sri Aurobindo has never concealed his opinion that a nation is entitled to attain its freedom by violence if it can do so, or if there is no other way. Whether it should do so or not depends on what is the best policy, not on ethical considerations. Sri Aurobindo's policy, position and practice was the same as Tilak's and that of other nationalist leaders who were by no means pacifists or worshippers of ahimsa. Marvelous. Speaking of the Indian view of this, what is sacred about a nation, based on the nature of essential identity between the individual and the group, Vyashti and Samashti, Sri Aurobindo explained the three bodies, the three shariras of a nation: the gross body, the subtle body, and the causal body. He said that these three are the bodies of the mother, but within them all is the source of her life, immortal and unchanging, of which every nation is merely one manifestation, the universal Narayan, one in the many, of whom we are all the children. This work of making people understand the deeper spiritual truth of nation was extremely important back in the day. But perhaps it has become even more relevant today as present generations try to grapple with what is true about the nation and what is true nationalism in this fast globalizing world. In Sri Aurobindo's vision, the modern and free Indian nation was not meant to be a colonial copy with this vast, elaborate outer machinery of huge bureaucratic structures left over by the British and now merely to be filled in by the Indians. Though he recognized the necessity for an effective and efficient external organization, but what he envisioned was the rebirth of a nation which is grounded in her unique temperament, shaped by her spiritual genius and conscious of her true mission. Nationalism for Sri Aurobindo had a spiritual aim. The aim to recover Indian thought, Indian character, Indian perceptions, Indian energy, Indian greatness, and to solve the problems that perplex the world in an Indian spirit and from the Indian standpoint. He cautioned that an exclusive focus or an exclusive preoccupation with politics and economics, something that again we see a lot today, almost to the abandonment of any other pursuit of life, could actually dwarf a nation's true and integral growth and prevent the flowering of energy, flowering of originality. Sri Aurobindo recognized the need, the value of an outer socio-economic development of a nation, but he reminded us to return to the fountainheads of our ancient dharma, our ancient philosophy, art and literature, and cast our political socio-economic development in the light of this rejuvenating spirit, the timeless Aryan spirit and ideals. In his Uttarpara speech in 1909, he had said something which speaks of the work that Indians must do. When he said that when it is said that India shall rise, it is the Sanatan Dharma that shall rise. When it is said that India shall be great, it is the Sanatana Dharma that shall be great. When it is said that India shall expand and extend herself, it is the Sanatan Dharma that shall expand and extend itself over the world. It is for the Dharma and by the Dharma that India exists. Dharma essentially is the foundation of life. From times immemorial, it is the ideal of Dharma which has been the true basis for a progressive and gradual growth of an individual in the collective. And therefore, Dharma is the true organizing principle for individual and collective life. Dharma, as we know, is not same as religion. While religion can become a divisive or exclusive force in society, and it does become, Dharma by its very nature is a uniting, harmonizing, rather a harmonizing force that we must awaken, that we must wake up to in our society. This mistranslation of Dharma into religion that has happened is one of the biggest blunders, causing a huge misunderstanding in the contemporary Indian context. And it has resulted in a great socio-cultural political conflict. As has been said, while religion and politics must necessarily be separate for a sane world, every shade of political thought and practice that is sane must have its basis in Dharma. We must wake up to the true meaning of Dharma as an overarching, integrating, harmonizing principle for organizing our collective life, for our national life. This is going to have deep implications for the kind of political, legal, administrative, governance structures that Indian nation state would create for itself, and the developmental and growth agenda that it would set for its state machinery. Ridding itself of the artificial dichotomy of what is secular and what is sacred, the socio-political organization of tomorrow's India must remold itself with Dharma at its very core. Then alone will India be marching towards its true role, its true purpose. In a remarkable passage, Sri Aurobindo compels us to reflect on the difficult question whether the present-day politics can ever raise itself to the level of the dharmic, spiritually guided work for the nation. Reminding us of the real mission for which India is rising, he also outlined for us the path that India may go through in her struggle to find her true Swabhava and Swadharma. He wrote, "Spirituality is India's only politics, the fulfillment of the Sanatan Dharma, its only Swaraj. I have no doubt we shall have to go through our parliamentary period in order to get rid of the notion of Western democracy by seeing in practice how helpless it is to make nations blessed. It is only when this foolishness is done with that truth will have a chance, the Sattvic mind in India emerge, and a really strong spiritual movement begin as a prelude to India's regeneration." This is the true significance of Sri Aurobindo's work as a revolutionary nationalist for India and for Indians today. Namaste.